In this video, we'll continue our discussion of the consequences of sexism by briefly reviewing how sexism affects women's careers. We'll also take a much deeper dive into stereotype threat, another consequence of gender stereotypes and sexism, than we have in the past. One important consequence of sexism relates to earnings, that is, wage gaps between men and women. I'm not going to go through as many visualizations as I did for racism in the United States, so don't worry about that, but I think it's important to understand some of these trends. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, the average gender pay gap in the United States in 2018 was around 18.9%, meaning that women working a full-time, year-round job earn 81.1% as much as their male counterparts. This pay gap, however, varies by state, and that's what you're looking at here. In Wyoming, for instance, the gender pay gap is 30.9%, the biggest wage gap in the nation. Louisiana is followed closely behind at 30.8%. California actually had the smallest pay gap in 2018, sitting at 12.2%, with full-time year-round women over 16 making a median salary of $49,177. Men, I'll note, on average made $56,023, so still quite a difference, but California leading in that area. And thinking about intersectionality, we find that Black and Hispanic women are most affected by the wage gap, especially when compared to white men who make up the largest demographic segment of the workforce. The data you're looking at here come again from the U.S. Census Bureau survey in 2018. So Asian women, interestingly, face the smallest wage gap. They earn 97% of what white men typically earn, resulting in a pay gap of just 3%. White women earn 80% of what white men do, while Black women earn 66% of what white men do, and Hispanic women earn only 58%, a pay gap, a wage gap of 42% compared to white men. When compared to Black men, Black women earn 89.4% and Hispanic women make 84.8% of what Hispanic men do. So across all of these different racial categories, we still find that women are at a disadvantage compared to men. Relatedly, representation gets worse for women and for people of color the higher up you go in the corporate pipeline, which importantly will, of course, affect the salaries of men versus women at a national level. For example, representation across the board is pretty good for entry-level corporate positions, but C-suite positions, the cluster of a corporation's most important senior executives, are still dominated primarily by white men. How might these trends arise and why? Undoubtedly, gender biases play a role, including in how people explain the successes of men versus women. What we've seen in the literature for decades is that when men succeed, it tends to be attributed to their ability. But when women succeed, it tends to be attributed to something else other than their ability. For example, for the task just being easy, or it's explained as women just trying harder. So when men succeed, oh, they're brilliant, they're geniuses, they're so smart. But when women succeed, people say, well, they had a lot of help, they were part of a really good team, or what they accomplished actually wasn't that impressive. It was an easy accomplishment. So again, very different explanations based on these gender biases. What we do see is that gender biases sometimes favor women, but only for stereotypically feminine tasks. For example, tasks that are said to require traits like being nurturing or communal more broadly. Moreover, women tend to be evaluated more negatively than men for work of equal quality. This depends a lot on the situation, and I'm not going to get into all the details, but just to illustrate, one classic study showed that essays written by John were evaluated significantly more favorably than when those same essays between subjects were written by someone named Joan. So the same essay either way, you just change the name and you find that John is rated more favorably. Let's turn our attention to one important consequence of stereotypes, prejudice, and sexism, their effects on performance. That is, stereotype threat. And as a reminder, what you're seeing here, you've already seen before. Specifically, we were talking about stereotype threat through an intersectional sort of race-gender lens. In a few moments, we'll return to focusing on gender stereotype threat effects, but I want to first take a step back to give you a fuller picture of what stereotype threat is all about. So lots of research has shown that members of underrepresented groups are able to do as well as majority group members, for example in academics. So why do we find differences in achievement between minority and majority groups? Well, Claude Steele has argued for decades that these differences stem from, and I'll quote him directly here from 2010, these differences stem from, quote, the things people have to deal with in a situation because they have a given social identity. One of the things people have to deal with is the knowledge of the stereotypic beliefs other people have about their group. And concerns regarding confirming those stereotypes can cause a host of problems, such as anxiety and reduced working memory capacity. Let's take a look at Steele's classic study, which was looking at stereotype threat effects in regards to race. In 1995, Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson asked black and white participants to take a test composed of the most difficult verbal questions from the GRE, the Graduate Record Examination. Half of the participants were told that the test was a valid indicator of intellectual ability. They called this the diagnostic ability, with the idea being that the test is diagnostic of your intellectual ability. It was a diagnostic measure of intelligence. The other half of the participants were told that the test was simply a laboratory problem-solving task. So it wasn't really directly related to intelligence, so they called this the non-diagnostic condition because it wasn't diagnostic of your intelligence. Steele and Aronson proposed that the diagnostic condition would induce stereotype threat for black people because their exam performance could confirm the stereotype that black people have lower verbal ability. Supporting this hypothesis, in two separate studies, black participants in the diagnostic condition scored significantly lower than black participants in the non-diagnostic condition or white participants in either condition who were unaffected by this manipulation, because white people don't have to face that same stereotype about their intelligence or their verbal ability. So the graph you've been looking at on the slide here depicts the number of items solved correctly collapsed across both studies 1 and 2. So we're kind of looking at one graph for both. Expanding beyond race, stereotype threat has been shown to be a very general process and a widespread phenomenon. For example, stereotype threat has been shown in many different groups based on gender, race, and all sorts of other social groups that you can imagine. It's been shown in many different academic settings, for example, in elementary and middle schools for kids, in private and public colleges and universities. Also in many testing settings, so in labs versus in field settings. And also in many different performance domains, in athletics, in the workplace, and even in driving. And in the last paper that I just mentioned, researchers found in one study that reminding women of the stereotype that, quote, women are poor drivers, resulted in their hitting jaywalkers in a driving simulation game twice more often than women who were not reminded of that stereotype. So just being aware of that stereotype, being reminded of your gender and a stereotype about that gender significantly impairs your performance on that task, which is a stereotype threat effect. And in a second study, the researchers illustrated that this effect is caused by an increase in cognitive load, or equivalently, a decrease in cognitive resources. Specifically, they devised a new manipulation in which the participants' attention was either divided or not divided while driving. Stereotype threatened participants who encountered jaywalking pedestrians with full attention available collided with the pedestrians at a rate that matched that of participants who were concurrently engaging in a grammatical reasoning task, suggesting that the threat manipulation was getting in the way of drivers' ability to focus on the road to a similar extent as engaging in an entirely different task altogether. And finally, I'll mention that stereotype threat effects have been documented for majority group members as well. Now, white men generally don't have to worry about their math ability, and they're not stereotypically believed to do poorly in math. Yet, white men experience significant performance drops. They do experience stereotype threat when they believe that the test is, quote, designed to determine why Asian men outperform white men in math. So it's kind of relative. Men also perform worse on a test of social sensitivity when they are threatened by the stereotype that they are less adept in decoding nonverbal cues than women are, compared to men who are not under stereotype threat or women in either the threat or no threat condition. So again, very parallel methodologies here, but the point is, even majority group members can experience stereotype threat. Nobody is immune. Now, there are many different manifestations of stereotype threat, various forms it can take. This table here describes various types of stereotype threat, that is, the factors that influence whether a particular threat or particular threats are operating are described here. Now, I won't take up your time reiterating the table. You can read it, but you should absolutely feel free to pause the video and explore these stereotype threat effects if you'd like.